Womenjaka, welcome everybody. Welcome to Melbourne Museum and the 2023 Museum Lecture Series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we work, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their ancestors and to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're guests on country. My name is Kate Phillips, and I welcome you here to Melbourne Museum. Thanks for coming out, and also welcome to those of you who are joining via the live stream. Tonight we celebrate National Science Week, yay! And we're having a wonderful lecture, Wonders of the Deep Sea. So Museums Victoria Research Institute scientist, Dr. Tim O'Hara, will lead us through findings from 2 voyages aboard the RV Investigator in the Indian Ocean. So I'm really looking forward to hearing all about those 2 voyages. And in the context of Tim's research uses museums' collections to answer large-scale questions about the distribution of seafloor animals. While Tim's particular specialty is brittle-stars, tonight he's going to tell us about many different aspects of the marine fauna, the geology and the seascapes that they were able to discover or to reveal on these voyages. So sit back, relax, you're going on a journey to a very unknown environment, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Tim O'Hara. Thank you.
Cool. It's nice to be here. Thank you for coming on this night of Matildas, you know. For a while I was thinking there would be no one in the audience whatsoever, you know, but luckily we've probably got an hour to get from here to wherever you're going to watch the game, so we should be okay, so you can relax for the time being. Anyway, I didn't want to steal their crowd, I suppose, you know, by having an overlapping event. So I'm going to take you way away from country tonight. So we're going to talk mostly about the Indian Ocean. I will show a little bit of the Pacific Ocean and a little bit of the deep sea around Australia as well. But predominantly it's about the Indian Ocean because it's really an area that very few Australians know about. Some people have been to holidays to Christmas Island and Cocos Island, but on the whole, we don't know much about them, and we certainly know nothing about the marine environment. So hopefully I can sort of fill that gap tonight. And there's going to be a lot about this ship, the Investigator, as well. And so that's CSIRO's premier blue ocean research vessel. So we'll talk a bit about that as well and what it's like to live on board. So the Investigator, it's not a tinny, it's a big ship. You know, there's about 100 metres long, just short of 100 metres long. It's 9 stories high, sleeps 60. And so it's really made to go out to the ocean and stay for a long time. It's been all the way to Antarctica a few times, it's been to Fiji, and it's been now to the Indian Ocean as well. So it's a big boat, and it has, you know, lots of facilities, lots of places to relax after a hard day. You know, there's even an area for a ping pong table, which I came second. And also, you know, a mess. So there's several cooks on board, and they cook breakfast, lunch and dinner. So it's actually, you know, it's really like a working village. They're dry ships, no alcohol anymore, which is a shame, but anyway, that's the way it goes. But it's probably a good thing because it is a working environment, and it's a good that, you know, people don't try and work inebriated. But it's yeah, it's a great platform to do fantastic science. So well done Australia for making it. It's now 10 years old almost, and so it's still going strong. But it's very competitive. Oh, we're going to show a video. Thank you for that. So this is just this is from a drone actually. In the background is Christmas Island, where we're going to go, and this is someone on shore had an industrial drone and they flew it around the ship, and we managed to get the footage as well. So it's just glorious to see this magnificent vessel with that sort of backdrop as well. But I want you to remember that landscape of Christmas Island. because I'm going to talk a lot about how these islands form and the fact that that's just the top of a very large mountain, the only bit that you can see. So we'll show you more about that later. So, as I said, it's a working ship as well. So we do 2 shifts, 12 hours each, so from 2 a.m. to 2 p.m. and 2 p.m. to 2 a.m. So it works 24 hours. I mean, it costs such a lot of money to put in the water that you don't waste a minute. Funny, when you read the narratives of the old literature from 150 years ago, like the Challenger expedition, which is really famous amongst marine biologists, you know, they did a sample every month or so, you know, as they cruised around the world for 3 years. And we're doing samples every 10 minutes, you know. So it's hectic, but it needs to be. And you generate so much data and so many kind of interesting facts on those trips. You know, we go away for 45 days, and that's enough data really for another 5 years of research after that. So it's a hell of a lot of information you gather just from going out. So it's got a large deck, and we pull up various things from cameras, small nets, small dredges here. And they get pulled on the back deck, they get secured, and then as a scientist we can go in and see what's being collected or what's some video footage from various things. It's also got laboratories on board. There's 3 laboratories, so we can even sit down with microscopes and identify animals on board. So where are these places? So these are the 4 voyages I'm going to talk about. But predominantly about the green and the red one on this right-hand map at the top there. So you can see those tracks. They're the tracks of the ships. Okay. I didn't have all the track of the green trip. That was in 2021. But that was an epic trip too, actually, because that was in the middle of COVID. So for a start, we had to go into 2 weeks of quarantine in Howard Springs. Beforehand. So you remember Howard Springs was Australia's quarantine centre. So that was kind of fascinating. In fact, we had a school of Aboriginal kids sharing the space with us as well. They were all going home and they had to quarantine going back into Northern Territory as well. And not only that, we got pulled back early because there was equipment issues, but we got all the way back to Perth. And then we weren't allowed to enter Perth Harbour because of COVID restrictions. And so we had to turn the ship and go all the way to Hobart. So it just became this epic 2-week trip all the way from Christmas Island to Hobart. And which sounds very nice. I mean, you do have, you know, everyone thinks of luxury cruise liners and sipping pina coladas. It's not like that, because what we hit down here, you see this little windy map down the bottom, is an enormous storm off southwest WA, which is like produce 8 to 9 metre waves. So it was a really hectic experience. And I had my birthday at that time too, so we were just getting thrown around trying to celebrate. Yeah, it was all very dramatic. So there's Christmas Cocos Island, but I'm also going to talk about a 2017 trip that we did along the Australia's east coast. So that's the brown line on the map there, and also another trip I did on a French boat near New Caledonia, which is that star. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is because it produced really wonderful footage, underwater video, so I can show you some of that as well. So these Christmas Island and Cocos Island, you know, they're a long way away. Cocos Island, in fact, is halfway between Western Australia and Sri Lanka, right? So it's really out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's sort of due south of Sumatra, whereas Christmas Island is due south of Java, more or less. But in terms of underwater seascapes, you know, it's all about volcanoes, ancient volcanoes, and sort of other volcanic structures like ridges as well. So the whole thing, so down on the, I think which way, you, left? So down on the lower left, you can sort of see an exaggerated picture of all the mountains in the area. So that's like you're standing in the northeast and looking across the map to the southwest. And the landscape is full of these enormous ancient volcanoes. Some of them are 100 million years old, right? And so they've been in the oceans an awful long time. And, you know, in fact, Australia was in a completely different position and the whole oceans look very different. So it really dates from a long time ago. So, and these are some of the seamounts in detail you can see on the right-hand side. And so they're important to our story, you know, trying to work out how they've evolved and what sort of animals live on them. And most of them have evolved by being volcanoes at some point. So this bottom diagram kind of gives you an impression of what happens, that, you know, you get a seafloor and there's a crack or something in the seafloor. Maybe the tectonic plates have been wrenched apart and causing little tears, and then the magma comes up and starts building up a volcano. For a long time that's underwater, but eventually so much magma is produced that they actually become little islands. They keep on growing into these enormous mountains, and then eventually become higher than the seafloor. So that's like the second little diagram there. So you get, and that's when they're most noticeable. And there's quite a few around the planet like that now, like White's Island, New Zealand. And, you know, there's another one here from Krakatoa, and the recent one in Tonga that people might know about as well. I'll show you some more pictures of Tonga later. But what happens over time is, after 1 million years or so, which is just a blink of an eye in geology time, the volcano often stops for whatever reason. The magma came bubbling up the seafloor there doesn't occur anymore. Those sort of forces have changed, and so maybe another volcano will start somewhere just nearby. But what happened to that volcano is that over time the waves cut it back to sea level. So all of that erosion will happening with all the waves crashing into it over time tends to actually produce a flat top. So you get a little flat top on the top of the mountain. And then what happens is even more amazing, because lava is really heavy rock, right? And most of the seafloor is a lighter rock. Is over millions of years, these volcanoes sink, right? They actually sink back into the crust. I'll show you some nice sectional diagrams of that later. And so what used to be at the surface gradually over time goes down to 500 meters, 1,000 meters, even 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers below the surface. So it's an amazing process. You don't think about mountains sinking, but yeah, that's exactly what happens in the marine environment. So the things we were looking at are really in that last stage. We're looking at mountains under the sea that have been above sea level at some point, but now a long way below. So let's start with this one, Murfield. I love this seamount. It is so big, and it was virtually undiscovered. And the next slide we'll go through a bit of the history of its discovery. But this just shows you kind of the work we're doing. We're in a ship on the top, and we're actually putting a electromagnetic radiation or sound down to the seafloor, and we're actually mapping it in great detail from the ship. And so we start off on the upper left over there. You can see that's kind of a clip from Google Maps, or even on your phone. If you put the satellite layer on Google Maps, you'll see something like that if you go to the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's just a fuzzy blob. So that's all we know. And this data comes from satellite measurements. So satellites are measuring gravity all over the surface, and they can kind of tell, look, there's something really big here, but we really don't know much more than that. And that's the state of our knowledge of a lot of the oceans. And so we start off with a fuzzy map, and we go over it, and 24 hours later we have a map like this. So it's just really exciting to be part of that process, you know, that you can see the landscape appearing on the computers as you go over it. And then you go, we were doing circles around. So the ship's captain was quite nervous about going to the summit, which is only 16 meters below sea level. And so we would edge forever a little bit closer, you know, to make sure we didn't hit it. And we went in tight, sort of like corkscrews right to the top. But then we can produce this, which is just extraordinary. And these are enormous, right? This is 70 kilometers across. This is like as large as Port Phillip Bay. You know, this enormous seamount that rises 5 kilometers. The tallest mountain in Australia on land is 2,000 kilometers. So that's 2 kilometers high. These are 4 to 5 kilometers high. You know, so they're by far the biggest mountains in Australia, even though they're underwater. And that's what it looks like from the surface. The top left, that's my photograph from the boat. You just can't tell it's there. There's this extraordinary seascape underneath. And from the surface, it just looked like another piece of sea. You get a few birds, a few whales, maybe, if you're lucky, but it's effectively, you can't see it. And that was a big problem for some of the early shipping, right? Because they didn't know these things were here. Hence, the Murfield, this bulk carrier down on the lower left, actually struck and hit the Seamount in 1973. So it didn't even know it was there. Its charts told it was in 5 kilometres of clear water, and it rammed a Seamount. It's a very large ship, a big draft, and also there was a bit of sea at the time, so it was going up and down, and just basically bang on the top, on that little kind of bluey bit on the top of the Seamount, hit the very top. So it had to sail and limp away to Singapore. They were okay, and the ship had to get repaired. So the Australian government thought, oh, we better chart this, we better do something about it. And so they, 10 years later, they sent a Navy survey ship, the HMS Moresby, out to actually work out exactly where it was. And using some pretty primitive technology to sort of try and guesstimate how deep it was at that point. But it all got very exciting because at the same time, Russia was testing some new space equipment, and they were going to test the prototype of their version of the space shuttle. I don't know if you've ever been to Moscow, but on the banks of the river there's actually a large spacecraft shaped exactly like the US space shuttle, and so they were working on their own version of the space shuttle at the same time as the Americans were back. But so the Australians decided, with the help of Americans, to actually go and check out this the landing of the space shuttle and try and take some photos. And so it became a whole cat and mouse Cold War thing. These Soviet destroyers were trying to cut them off, and some of the Australian sailors were in these little helicopters trying to get a sneak a look at what the prototype looked like. The Russian sailors were firing flares at the helicopters, all very dramatic. But they did manage to get some photos. But they're only a prototype. It's only just basically a shape and design. It was a small kind of prototype of what they were hoping to build. Anyway, that was the second time that Murfield came into sort of world history. So Cocos Keeling is nearby, 100 kilometres to the north of Murfield. And it, again, is an enormous seamount, right? And so the islands, I don't know if you've been there, but there's kind of those browny coloured in the lagoon at the top. They're the islands. They're more or less sort of sand spits. They only go to about 8 metres high in the tallest point. And that's what it looked like down on the lower right. It's more or less just a very low-lying sandy island. But there, just because they're rimming the edge of this flattened kind of seamount that sits on the seafloor, that no one has mapped. So we were the first people to come across and map that. And Sam, can you play the video? So this is like a 3D animation of the map. And we actually showed it we did a live cross to the islands quite a few times, both the primary school, the high school, and then the Shire Council and the Marine Care Group. And all these groups wanted to see it because no one had actually seen their islands and shown them what the seafloor looked like. And so it was just a real eye-opener. And I find that's an eye-opener that in 2024, we still don't have maps of some of our offshore islands. But again, that's the state of our knowledge. But it's just, yeah, it's very cool. Very cool technology that you can see exactly what's happening. And that's a photo of the ship from the shore. That was actually taken by the Australian Federal Police. That's okay, because he was part of the Marine Care Group and he was just sharing the photo, but I thought that was kind of amusing. And the Cocos Keeling Islands have a really amazing history, right? I mean, it started off, the people found it about 400 years ago, some sailors going past. But the first guy who decided to actually take people there wanted to create a harem on the island. So he took about 100 Malay women with him back to Cocos, and he was a bit of a scurrilous character. The second person who landed, John Clooney's Ross, they were supposed to be partners, but they rapidly fell out over this kind of process. And also Alexander Hare, the guy with the harem, really treated a lot of his people as slaves, pretty much. And so there was a lot of tension, and eventually actually Alexander Hare went bankrupt and he left, and all the women came over and joined the other group. And so it became the permanent settlement. But Queen Victoria granted it to the Clunies-Ross family as like a fiefdom, and it continued like that for over 100 years. So really they were in charge, they had total control of the islands, and all of the workers, they didn't pay them money, they just gave them credit at their shop. So it was still like semi-slavery in a way. And this is amazing, this continued into the 1970s. So Australia was given jurisdiction over the island in 1955. The Queen actually visited there in 1954. But it was a really strange bit of sort of colonialism in some ways. And they didn't actually have, education, proper education until 1980. So it's a really amazing, it's really a question of out of sight, out of mind, the tiny little speck of an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I've got a question. So there's about 450 Malays, of sort of descendants of the Malay community, and about 150 kind of more European settlers there. And Christmas Island is about 1,500. Yeah, so yeah, pretty amazing. But I've never actually been on the island because of the whole COVID situation. Again, we couldn't land either on Christmas or Cocos, so we had to just go around the island and look, and I'd really love to go. I'd love to go there one day, but I think it'd be a fantastic place just to have a look around. So this is the schematic I'm talking about. So you can see the seafloor that's over on the left, on the bottom, that there's all this basalt in kind of purpley blue there. And so it's a big plug of volcanic rock, and it's sunk. But what's amazing about this, why it's still an island and not a seamount, is that the coral and other marine creatures have left enough calcium carbonate, enough on the top to continually build limestone. So as it's sunk, their life has continued to build on top of it. So now there's like a kilometre of limestone on the top. And so it's actually kept abreast with the sinking and any sea level changes as well. Charles Darwin also visited these islands, and he came up with this theory about coral reefs growing around the rim, and sort of becoming bigger because they were next to the sort of the rim of the island. And people no longer think that now. They think because during ice ages, the sea level falls by 100 metres because all of the seawater goes into the big ice caps. And what happens is that it becomes like a much higher mountain sticking out, and rain accumulates on the top and dissolves the limestone in the middle. So you tend to get this kind of lagoon-shaped thing in the middle, and that's how people now consider these sort of atolls are formed. So Christmas Island's different. It's more or less just it's a much bigger island at the top, so it goes several hundred meters up in the air. There's steep cliffs all the way around it, and it's not sand like Cocos, so it's quite a different island. And it has a different geological story. So what's happened then, it was a volcano, it did sink, but now something else is happening to Christmas Island. It's actually on a tectonic plate. It's on the Australian tectonic plate, and that plate has been rammed into the plate under Indonesia. Right, and there's actually a trench there where the two meet, and there's all these forces as it comes in. One plate has been forced into the other one, and it sort of buckles. The plate is buckled up, and Christmas Island is now on the top of the buckle, as you can see in the diagram on the lower right. And so it's now sticking up above the seafloor again. So it was above the sea level, and then it sank, and now it's been pushed up above the sea level again. So it's quite, and it's been there for a few million years, and it's been a bird rookery for a long time too. So not only has it got limestone on the top from all the corals, but it's also got a lot of guano and phosphate on the top as well from all the bird poo. So it's just been mined and formed the basis of a superphosphate industry for quite some time. I suppose I should say one more thing about that story. In 5 billion years, that island will be in the trench and will be kind of like completely swallowed up. So, you know, there's actually still going up and down, but, you know, whether even humans are going to be around in 5 billion years, we don't know. So I don't think I would overly worry about that. But there's also evidence of proper volcanoes down there as well, not just the ones that have come above water and been flattened at the top. We can actually see some of the volcanoes, and some of them are really deep. So this is one we cheekily call the Eye of Sauron, because when we first saw it, it was sort of sticking on the end of the ridge at the top, and it really looked like that kind of eye in the Lord of the Rings films. But here it is at 3.5 kilometres deep. There's this enormous, perfectly formed caldera, which is a kind of a volcano where the whole magma chamber has exploded out, and sort of it forms this enormous cavity within the volcano. And sometimes a little volcano will grow up in the middle, and so you get that characteristic ring with a volcano in the middle, like you can see on the far left, just underneath where I've got Eye of Sauron. And this is exactly what happened to the Tongan volcano recently. I don't know if you kept abreast of this, but you know, a few months ago there was this enormous explosion, enormous volcanic eruption in Tonga, where the plume of ash and pumice and stuff went up, you know, 15 or so kilometres into the stratosphere. And what it did is it blew the whole middle section out. That's another one of these maps done by ships from the top, in this case using drones. I don't want to get too close to the actual volcano itself, but you can see that it's completely blown out the middle. And it produced so much ash and pumice that it's covered the seafloor all around. In some places 50 meters of kind of ash and debris. You know, the ships went there trying to find the internet cables, and they just couldn't find them. There was just so much debris, up to hundreds of kilometers away from the volcanoes. They're just so much power and so much material. And there's another one we found on the lower right as well, but this is much more regular looking volcano. But again, down at 4,000 meters below sea level. So extraordinary that the seafloor is full of all these amazing sort of formations. And most of the seafloor there is particularly deep. It's almost 6 kilometres deep, and I'll show you maps of the seafloor later, but we're really interested in this very deep seafloor because some of the deepest seafloor in Australia. And so we went on the upper left. You can see we went quite close to Christmas Island, very close to the border with Indonesia, and some of these incredibly deep sections. And what you have on the seafloor there is manganese nodules. So these are these little potato-like nodules where all of these rare earths and special minerals have been percolating or precipitating out of the seawater for millions and millions of years. And this is actually what people want to mine now. I don't know if you've heard about deep sea mining, particularly in the Pacific. These ones aren't particularly good grade. No mining going to happen in Cocos and Christmas Island, but in the middle of the Pacific, they are talking about doing some deep sea mining if they can get the technology right. But that's what the seafloor looks like. There's just, yeah, lots and lots of these smaller rocks with lots of animals in between. I know you haven't seen an animal yet. We will get to animals, I promise. And this is just to show you really that what the oceans are. You know, I mean, you know, when people first went to the moon and looked back to the Earth or into space, they sort of said, oh, it's the blue Earth. You know, Earth is mostly water, and it really captured the astronauts' imagination. But most of the sea is deep sea. Most of the sea is more than 4 kilometres deep. 50% of the planet is 4 kilometres or more of seafloor, depth of seafloor. So really, in my imagination, we should be calling it the dark blue planet. You know, it's not just the blue planet, but it's really deep sea dominates Earth. And you can see that in the blue colour in the map up there. And this is just a quick kind of section. I don't know if you can follow these sorts of things, the graph down the bottom, but that red line on the map, that's like I've done the seafloor depth all along that line, and you can see it going from the continents, going right down to 4, 5, 6 kilometres, and then going up into these seamounts, and then up into Indonesia as well. So what is it to be deep? That's the other question. I mean, and deep is such an imprecise term, and lots of people use it in different ways. I mean, a scuba diver thinks 50 meters is deep, right? You know, I mean, there are people who go in nuclear submarines may get down to 500 meters if they're really pushing their luck, you know. But that's 500 meters. There's still traces of light at 500 meters, you know. But where we're researching is down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kilometers below the sea floor. I mean, there have been submarines go down. There was the famous one built by the director of Avatar, James Cameron. He built his own submarine and went all the way down to 10 kilometers below the sea level. So yeah, he's deep. I'll accept he's deep, but not a lot of the scuba diver talk of deep. They don't really know the meaning of deep. Anyway. So what happens with marine life down there? It's really, marine life tends to vary according to temperature. Different animals like different temperatures, right? Different animals like different pressures. Different animals like different levels of oxygen. And these are all the really important things that actually determine what lives where in the deep sea. Oxygen, and as well as history a bit too. You know, if you've been if an animal been living close to the area, then you can expect it to also live on that sort of seamount. So there's a bit of history as well. But there's only a few things that really determine what lives on the seafloor and why. But depth is so important. That pressure is intense, and it brings with it all those other things. So this is a schematic of Christmas Island, kind of like a cut through. And so at the top, you know, the sea can be 30 degrees Celsius at the surface. By the time you get to 200 meters, it's like 5. And then by the time you get right down to the bottom of the seafloor, it's only 1 degree Celsius. So it's really cold. And that water comes all the way from Antarctica, right? So you've got the ice at the poles freezing the shallow water around Antarctica and to a certain extent the North Atlantic as well. And it's forcing that cold, oxygenated water down to the bottom of the seafloor where it flows. It takes about 1,000 years to go all the way around the deep sea. So really the bottom of the sea is Antarctic water, and the animals are quite closely related to the ones that live around the Antarctic. Animals. So we start with the fish. I mean, I don't study fish, but the fish are the drama queens of the deep sea, right? I mean, they're all, you know, they're just amazing to look at, and they had the fangs, they had all the body parts that have been modified in so many different ways. So yeah, they are important to start with the fish, even though I'd say that grudgingly, being an invertebrate zoologist. But so the way I think about deep sea is fangs and jelly, right? Because there's not a lot of food. And so none of the fish down there can support a large set of muscles. They have to use other techniques to get food, and there's not a lot of food, and so you really want to hang on to your food. You really want to have big teeth, and when you grab on, you're not going to let go, because that might be your only meal for the next 2 or 3 months. So you're really going to hang on. So if you look at all these fish, that's what I see. I see this kind of jelly-like consistency, which means it doesn't have a lot of muscles, mostly tendon, and doesn't have a large energy requirement, doesn't need a lot of food. And they have teeth. They all have these enormous teeth. This dragonfish, for example, you know, look at those fangs on the dragonfish. Some fish actually have special holes in their skull where those teeth fit into, you know. Yeah. And they're blind cusk eel. I mean, the cusk eels are just amazing. They are like gelatinous sort of hunks of fish, but, you know, this one at the top, the faceless fish, you know, it actually doesn't, who needs eyes, right? At 4 kilometers, there's no light. And its mouth is underneath because it eats the little kind of pippies and stuff in the sediment. So when you look at it face on, there is actually no eyes, there's no nose, there's no mouth. And so it's got the name, the faceless fish, but it really does sum up this amazing fish. And they're often ambush predators. Right, so they lurk there just waiting. They're not going to use a lot of energy kind of zooming around every place trying to chase stuff. They're going to sit there and wait till food comes to them, and then they're going to pounce. A lot of things live in the sediment, or just above the sediment. And some of them are really weird shapes, you know, and when you see them in the videos, they just kind of bobble along, you know, not doing much, but it's all part of their strategy to actually, I guess, just lie in wait for the animals to come and then pounce. And the tripod fish, so their fins down the bottom have actually developed into these huge kind of antenna-like things that can actually be used like a camera tripod. So it can actually sit on those three things, so they can actually sit above the seafloor and wait for the prey to approach them. And bioluminescence, a lot of fish make their own light. I mean, this is a world without light, right? And so, and yet light is so useful. You've got the threadfins, you know, they've actually almost got lanterns on the front of their face. Perhaps they use them for communication, we don't know. We don't know a lot about it. It's really difficult to study these animals way down like a kilometre deep. I mean, how do you do that? You just, you know, you luck certain video shots, or you luck, you know, certain specimens coming up in nets or whatever to give you an insight what's happening. But we don't really have a lot of behavioural data and that sort of stuff. But some of them are really clever, like the hatchetfish over there has these lights underneath the bottom. And so what it can do, right, because it's the way people look for it as prey. If it's other fish trying to eat the hatchetfish, they'll go underneath it and try and look for its shadow, because if there's a trace of light, right, it forms a shadow. And so that means the predator can see it and come and get it. Whereas these fish have got these lights on the underside, and they can exactly match the light they're receiving from the top. So they become effectively invisible. So pretty amazing. And others are using it for, you know, to find mates, to you know, sometimes deter predators as well, like a big flash to sort of say to predator, go away. I can see a few hands up, but we are going to have questions at the end, so maybe if you just hang on, is that right? Okay, yeah. But it's not just the fish. In fact, a lot of animals down there produce light as well. So this was on our 2017 voyage. That's Jerome there, and he was a specialist in sort of measuring the light produced by deep sea animals. And it turned out, you know, about 50% of the animals we were collecting produced light of some sort or another. So what they're making up for, you don't have the sun, you don't have, you know, the light that we're using to actually see. So they're producing their own for a whole variety of purposes. We also found ancient teeth, ancient shark's teeth. In particular, one of our last stops on the Cocos Island trip, in 5 kilometres of water, we really came over what kind of appears to be a shark graveyard. I mean, there was 700, I think, shark's teeth in one of the small scrapings we did from the seafloor. I mean, these things have accumulated over a long time. So, you know, I'm not suggesting that all sharks swim there and just die in situ or something, but it just shows you that some undisturbed areas of the seafloor, you know, these things just accumulate over millions of years. And you can see on the one on the left, it's actually starting to change colour. It no longer looks like a tooth. It no longer looks like that, you know, the sort of the paler colour that you can see in some of those shots. It's starting to be covered by these minerals, as I was saying before, like the same process that create those manganese nodules is happening on these teeth. You know, the manganese is starting to form around the bottom. You can see that kind of bright metal. And then also the whole tooth itself is darkening. But these are ancient white sharks and mako sharks, actually. So from potentially up to 5 million years ago. It's the same family as Megalodon, you know, the Meg of the movie. These aren't. That's an even bigger tooth again, but it's in the same sort of family. Yeah, so really exciting. And there's lots of other creatures as well. There's sponge crabs. I mean, Kate had it in her slide, but that's very cool. So these crabs live inside sponges for defense. You've got other ones, that some hermit crabs that in fact use these things that are related to anemones to hide. So they don't have shells, particularly a lot of shells down there. And so they're using another animal, and they always tend to be together too. It's a symbiotic relationship. Lots of different corals. I mean, not the corals that we see on the coral barrier reef, because they often have a symbiont that needs light. They have these little algae in them that collect light, or they're photosynthetic, and they produce sugars and stuff for the coral. None of that can happen, of course, in the deep sea, and so they need a different process, and so they're just more carnivores, but they're, you know, all shapes and sizes: gold corals, bamboo corals, black corals, a whole lot of stuff. They're chianomes. They're my favourite group. Brittle-stars, which is that little guy at the top there, the star-shaped thing. And I'll show you more photos. There's a whole slide of brittle-stars, so you have to indulge me later. But there's sea urchins, you know, lots of sea urchins that are actually big predators in the deep sea. They actually go and try and chase down things like feather stars and other things as well, and eat them. And the holothurians too, the sea cucumbers down the base there. I mean, in shallow water, they tend to be these big snake-like things. You probably see them if you go to the coral reefs, but the shapes and sizes are just amazing in the deep sea. Long things with long tails, lots of processes and stuff as well. And the crabs, always the crabs. They're beautiful. So, and a lot depends on where you live too, and things are always trying to get up higher. So there's more current the higher you get. So right against the seafloor tends to be a bit of a low current zone. So things are always trying to get up on perches all the time. So this thing here is actually an old feather star stalk, a sea lily stalk, and then there's a new feather star living on it, and a thing that's related to an anemone living on it as well. So again, there's a whole thing about getting up and out of the bottom zone if you can. And we got another video. So so this is down. This is off New Caledonia, and it's down about 500 meters. And this just shows you a little bit of the seafloor. I just love this. These are all animals, right? These are not plants, even though they're very plant-like in some ways. These big things there, what I talked about before, they're the sea lilies. So they're like feather stars, but they have a stalk and they're attached to the substrate. And they're waving their arms a little bit because there's light, right? So there's light from the camera, and you know it's been 100 million years since they saw, or their ancestors saw light, so they're a little bit startled. But nonetheless, it doesn't do them any great harm, and it just shows you their movement. And just all of these swirling movements, and what each of the arms does is either has little tiny tube feet with little suckers and things, so it can pull plankton out of the water, or sometimes these animals cover themselves in mucus, right? And so it just becomes like the old-fashioned fly wraps, you know, you're just putting up sticky mucus, and all the little tiny animals and other things in the like bits of floating detritus and stuff stick to them, and that's how they live. So, you know, they're really, again, not a lot of food. They're really having to use every technique they can to actually to capture food, and sometimes they very little movement, and they can sit there for 50 years sometimes, only eating once every 6 months or so. Yeah, so it's an amazing seascape, very, very otherworldly in some ways. Cool. So these are my brittle-stars. So these are my favourite, and I mean, they look fantastic, I think, personally, but it's not only that, it's because they're great to map, and I'll show you more of that later. But that's the kind of using them as an example of a seafloor group that I can actually say a lot about the origins of the seas and where things live and that sort of stuff. But they come in all shapes and sizes, 2,200 species around the world. That's described. I think there's probably 10,000 once we stop looking. But, you know, lots of, all the way from coral reefs down to the deepest trench, all the way from the poles to the equator. I mean, these things dominate the deep sea in places as well. So it's really, you know, even though you probably have never seen them, you know, very few people know what a brittle-star is, surprisingly, but they're one of the groups that just explode over the deep sea. And even around coral reefs, you'll see a lot of little arms sticking out of things. As well, lots of different colours and shapes and sizes, but basically all the one plan, like a round disc with a mouth underneath and 5 arms, and they do all sorts of things. You know, they can they cover themselves with mucus, like I said, or sometimes they can go hunting and use their arm as kind of get things in an arm lock, and then capture them that way. Some of them even use the tip of their arm like a spear. I've seen them in Antarctica when they just, a fish will go over past and the brittle-star will just go bang in the bottom, and it just hits a particular part of the fish that stuns it actually. And then they try and jump on and smother it before it can get away. Not always successfully. But in some species, actually, the arms branch, like on the far left there. And so it becomes this huge basket. They're called basket stars, obvious reasons, but it becomes a bit like the sea lilies I was showing you before. They're very much putting their arms out and catching things from the water column. So this one I named after George Martin, right? The guy who wrote the Game of Thrones books, because I was really hoping he'd come out with another book. He never did, so I'm kind of cross at him for that. But because it looked like a crown on one of his books, all those it's got a round disc, so there's a bit of that picture in the middle, just near the top left, and there's 5 kind of big points coming out of the disc, and look like a crown. But another thing I really want to emphasize about this area in particular is that it's how connected the sea is, right? I mean, on land, things are isolated into islands, and there's not a lot of movement between one island or one continent for another, but the sea is connected. You know, there's this whole sort of, I guess, theme at the moment to describe the oceans as the one ocean, emphasizing its connectivity, the fact that, you know, life just swirls around and it works as a whole, one ecosystem. But things really, are connected, and they go for a long ways. They really travel a long way. This is a whale shark migration in the lower right here. And so someone actually tagged a whole lot of whale sharks in Ningaloo and watched where they went. You know, and after sometimes 10 days, sometimes 100 days, they go all the way to Indonesia, all the way to Christmas Island, or further into the Indian Ocean. So it's extraordinary how far these animals travel. And it's the same with manta rays, same with turtles, and lots of other animals like that. You know, they're really traveling a long way. So what happens at Christmas Island is that there's this crab that lives on Christmas Island called the red crab. And once a year, they all travel down in November, December. They go to the shore and they reproduce and produce lots of larvae. So it's a big migration from the inland near the mountain. They all come down to the seafloor and reproduce. And there's a lot of larvae after that. There's a lot of eggs in the water. And so that's really nutritious food. So the whale sharks kind of know this, and so they'll actually head there and feast on these red crab larvae for as long as they last. And they're red, right? So the whale's poo is red when it comes out the other side, which is kind of funny. Or whale shark. They're the red crabs up there. But even animals that can't swim are connected by these larvae, right? So typically what happens in a marine invertebrate is that you have eggs and sperm, and the animals don't even have to be close to each other. Sometimes they'll be 20 meters away, and the female will produce eggs, and they'll float and then get caught in the cloud of sperm and become fertilized, become these little larvae that can last for a long time. And so the little feeding larvae like this one here, so it can float in the oceans for 2 or 3 months, maybe longer, and it can eat. So it eats tiny little single cell algae, and lots of some small animals as well, until it gets big enough and strong enough, and it finds the right kind of area to settle, and then it metamorphoses and becomes a juvenile of that species. So that's what happens in the shallow water. But in the deep sea, it's different. Right? Because there's not a lot of life down there, so there's not a lot of stuff in the water for these larvae to eat. So you tend to get these yolky larvae, and because it's so cold, they go into like a suspended animation, and so these things can last sometimes a year on the deep sea currents. And so the deep sea is really connected. You know, and what's amazing is it tends to be connected at the same depth. So if you get 2 seamounts and you've got all these layers, you'll find the same animals live in the same depths on each seamount, even though they've had to actually reproduce, form a larvae, and it's had to settle. It always happens in these depth bands. So, you know, the way I like to think about it is just kind of like horizontal highways of life through the oceans. connecting all these different places. And again, you know, these can happen over really long distances, as I'll show you in a minute. I know I'll show you on this slide. So this is the orange roughy. I don't know if you've ever eaten orange roughy, but it lives off Tasmania. It's a really old, slow-growing deep sea fish. Can live up to 150 years old. And for a while, it was very common in Australia. People were eating it a lot because they discovered huge abundances of these things on seamounts south of Tasmania. It's been fished out, and there's far fewer now. So there's only a little bit of orange roughy that is fished now. But that's just kind of distribution. So you're getting the same animals going all the way from Iceland and Greenland all the way to New Zealand. And that's true of my animals as well. And I know from looking at their DNA, they're the same species all the way from Iceland to Tasmania, which just blows me away. You know, that's half the planet. And these things have managed to actually use their larvae or whatever to drift long distances and form new populations. And that's how much these oceans at depth are connected. So the other thing I want to talk about is that you know, deep sea life is often sort of portrayed like a freak show, and it's kind of, I know I tend to do it as well. You know, I talk up the bizarre looking nature of these things, and you get, you know, this was from The Age some years ago, and, you know, every photographer wants a shot of a weird looking museum animal. And it kind of bugs me in the end, because actually what they are is they're superbly adapted to their environment, right? They're not sort of some sort of weird thing that's just aesthetically challenging for humans. They're actually a product of a lot of evolution to develop superb strategies to cope with such a difficult environment. And no doubt they think we look strange as well, if it's in the reverse. So I'm really sort of keen on not trying to characterize things as freak shows. You know, you've got to see life as superbly adapted and sort of, you know, at its pinnacle of its evolution. But there's, as I said, you know, you can go out to sea for 35 days and then there's so much work to do after that, you know. So the government gives us money to do this sort of research, and we have to produce all sorts of documents about what areas were special, what areas had more animals than other areas, you know, what is known about these areas apart from what we found, and that sort of stuff as well. So there's an awful lot of data produced for these sorts of trips. A lot of maps are produced. And then, you know, of course, we do statistics as well. So, you know, science tends to be heavily mathematical. And so you're getting all this information from all these different animal groups, from fishes to sponges to, you know, shells, all sorts of things, and then trying to combine it and trying to show it in a way that makes it simple, you know, that to actually, not too simple, but to get the kind of the truth out of it, to get the really important elements of what you're seeing, you know, to sort of wade through all of that data and present something that really means something to people. And so that's a lot of work. So a lot of DNA work in particular now. So we're not just looking at animals, but we're actually taking samples and then doing their DNA. And from that, we can work out how closely they are related. And that's really exciting, because then we can start talking about when things moved, because we can sort of say, well, it's probably about 2 million years ago when that animal split from this animal, judging from the differences in their DNA. And then we can talk about the origins. I mean, where did the Tasmanian or the Victorian animals come from? You know, what is the history? You know, how do we think about it? And so you can sort of answer all of these sorts of questions using DNA. So it's increasingly important, but that's a lot of work as well. And eventually I want to put it all into maps. I want to look at where things live and how they're related to each other, and develop a whole series of maps for the globe about how things are connected. You know, and these are just some examples here. So the one on the top left shows the hot tropics, and that's had one suite of animals mostly. And then in southern Australia and New Zealand, you get another. The green colour shows there's another suite of animals, and then going down to the poles, there's another suite of animals. So there's like fundamentally different suites of animals as you move in latitude or temperature. We can do things like where places the marine parks are. So the United Nations just recently proposed a mechanism to be able to create marine parks in areas that no nation owns. This is the first time that's happened. So up to now, we do create marine parks and we put them into, into areas that Australia claims or the US claims or whatever. But now we can actually, there's a process we can actually create marine parks that will be free of exploitation in the high seas, the areas that no one owns. So that's really important. And then this is the DNA stuff as well. So there's a very complicated tree down the bottom left there. But the sort of the colours indicate animals that live in different areas and depths, and you can just see things that all the reds stick together, a lot of the browns stick together, and that shows you how different species are related to each other and how they've moved around the planet. I won't go into too much detail because you get things like this showing you those highways of life over tens of millions of years as well. So it's really what we're trying to build is a history of the oceans, trying to say where the animals came from and how they move around. And as I said, there's really great conservation outcomes as well. So around Christmas and Cocos, the Commonwealth Government have just a couple of years ago announced 2 enormous new marine parks. So virtually all the area that Australia claims around those 2 islands have been put in marine park, and it's larger than the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So it's really significant. I mean, together they're almost the size of New South Wales. So Australia actually we claim the 3rd largest extent of ocean of any country. The first is the US because of all their islands. The second is France, also because of their remnants of their empire, and the 3rd is Australia. So Australia has the 3rd largest marine domain on the planet. And so we've got to look after it. So these are all the marine parks that have been created in the areas around Australia, the areas that we claim. Not all of them have got great protection. There's been a bit of controversy over the last couple of weeks about seismic testing, one of the marine parks off Tasmania, which doesn't actually surprisingly ban seismic testing, but but they do have some management at least, so and some parks are actually exceedingly well protected. So we're getting there. And that's really all I have to say. So it's an enormous effort. It takes a lot of work. We've really got to try and connect with other museums elsewhere, try and build global pictures, try and build, connections that we can sort of tell the history of the oceans. And it's sort of really, we know there's a lot of climate change at the moment. Things are changing, and we really just want to get a handle on how life is now before it perhaps irreversibly changes. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tim. Now we do have time for a few questions. We've gone on a little bit long, so if people need to go, it was so fascinating to hear you, Tim. So don't apologise, but I just am conscious that some people might need to go, but if you can stay, do, because we would love the chance to ask some of those questions that were obviously provoked by that wonderful talk. Yeah. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, pop your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you, because in that way everyone can hear the question loud and clear. So we have one up the back there. Thank you.
I have an example about a fish that makes bioluminescence, which is the barrel eye fish, and I just wanted to know if you have seen any.
No, I haven't personally, but no, I haven't. So I can't really comment on that particular fish. But when first time you see bioluminescence in the water, it blows your mind. If you dive at night, if you ever get the chance to scuba dive at night, and you can see the bioluminescence in front of your eyes, or even sometimes you can move your hand through the water and see trails of lights. It's just such a magical feeling. So no, I can't comment on your specific example. I'm not a fish biologist, as I said, but I do appreciate them.
Great, thank you. In the centre there.
Hi. Yeah, I've got the question about how many have you and your team? How many different creatures have you and your team discovered?
It depends what you mean by discovered. Discovered means, like, I reckon, when we go on our voyages, maybe 30% of all the animals we find. Like in our last voyage, we would have collected 1,000 species. Not many of each one. We just take a small amount of seafloor and we just go through that and see what we can find. But about a third of them, maybe 300 species will be new. People have never, ever seen before. But it takes a long time to put a name to it, because to actually describe a new species, you've got to make sure it's not one of the other tens of thousands of species that have already been described. So it's actually quite an involved process to actually finally say, yes, it's new. But I imagine 30%. So deep sea, we still don't know a lot.
Up the back there. Yep.
I'm just wondering, when you bring up all of the species, because of the pressure change, are they all dead by the time they make it to the surface? Or?
It's also a lot of temperature, particularly in the tropics. So they don't like coming from 1 degree to 30 degrees. So when they get to the surface, yeah, they're pretty slow moving. Often they're still alive, but they're sometimes, so things die sometimes on the way up, which is unfortunate. But
how long was like the longest? How long has it lasted, I guess?
How long can things last? It depends on the animal. Yeah. You often see crabs that are still alive, and crabs seem to have an ability to. Other things just don't cope with the conditions. I want to emphasise that we're not out there raping and pillaging the oceans. We actually no, but it is an important thing, because people do ask me, why do you collect animals at all? But the thing is, you need 1 or 2 just to describe a new species, and so we do collect and we do bring them back. But those animals are all upstairs. And we have 16 million animals, but mostly it's tiny little things from all around Australia, and in fact all around the globe. And we use them to describe new species, and they will last in that condition for 500 years. So it becomes a time capsule as well. This is the animals we collected, at that point in time. And it's there for the long-term use of any bona fide scientist who wants to come along. We do actually have lots of visitors come and have a look and describe new animals or whatever from our collections here. So it's really important.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question not about the creatures, but about the ship.
Yeah.
And I noticed that on the slide it was referred to as a competitive ship.
Yeah, in terms of, for me to go on board a CSIRO ship, I have to actually bid for ship time. So there's a process once a year when the government says who wants to go on a ship, give us a really good reason you want to go, and you have to fill out a 50-page application, and it takes you months to do, and no institution's big enough to do it by themselves. So we invite all the other museums around Australia to join our trips when we've led. So we build up a big team, and we can go and investigate properly. So that's what I mean by competitive. So it's actually to go on it. And also there's climate scientists who want to go on it. There's oceanographers who want to go on it, geologists who want to go on it. And so it's not just biologists.
So it is a competition, who gets on and who doesn't.
Yeah. Well, it's there's a committee that evaluates the best proposals. Yeah.
You have one in the front.
When you're on expeditions and you go near thermal vents or underwater volcanoes, do you discover lots of different species that get attracted to the geothermal vents down there?
We don't have really very many geothermal vents in Australia, so we haven't actually targeted those specifically, but I know what you mean. And yes, you often, thermal vents are great because they release heat, so you can actually sort of use temperature as a way of just finding out where they are, and then going and having a look. And people have done that in other places where they exist, and they do. Yes, they target those. They say we know nothing about vents in the Indian Ocean. They propose to some ship that they can go out there, and then they take a lot of scientists and go and investigate. And so they really target those habitats we've never seen before. Yes. I guess for R1 it's seamounts, which I talked a lot about, mountains under the sea. And so that was the kind of the habitat that we were targeting. Yeah.
Fabulous. We've got 2 more questions, or maybe 3 more questions in the audience. First in the middle.
So have you done any deep sea benthic habitat modelling and subsequent habitat suitability, distribution and abundance modelling of brittle-stars?
Yes, I have done that. So that was probably a very complicated question for the rest of you guys, but basically what you do is you find out a whole lot of where animals live, and you match it against oxygen, temperature, a whole lot of things, and then you say, well, I know where the similar habitats live in other places. I draw a range for that species, and yes, we do that all the time. And so it's important because we can only ever just explore, I guess, little areas at once, and so you have to interpolate to build up a bigger picture. So absolutely, yeah. But it's yeah. I mean, it's hard to get the primary data too. I mean, because you use a lot of model data, environmental data. It's probably too complex an answer to give here, but yeah, there are issues with trying to do it. It's very coarse in the deep sea. Let's put it that way.
Maybe you can follow that question up afterwards.
Sure.
At a bit more depth. Over this side.
How do you collect the animals if they're so deep down?
So we have a very long rope. So on the Investigator, it's actually, because it's so long, it's actually made out of wire. So it's a thick wire, about this thick. And at the moment, it's about 8 kilometres long. 8 kilometres long. And so we attach things to the end of this long wire, either cameras or small little boxes, which we call dredges, or a small net, and then we sort of drag it across the seafloor and bring it back up. Yeah, and so we do it really remotely, and people have been doing this for hundreds of years. It's very low tech in a way. Like other nations have advanced submarines and things. Australia doesn't have that capacity. We do in the shallow water, but not for deep sea stuff. And so we don't have a way of going down and just using arms to pick up individual animals. We have to do it the old-fashioned way. But I'm sure it will change one day.
And I think we might make it the last question over here.
I'm just curious about when you get the specimens up to the boat, do they look as they appear when you preserve them, or are they brighter or more colourful, or are they typically just
I don't think
colour?
the colour doesn't change much. Once you preserve them, the colour changes a lot because a lot of colours are soluble in alcohol, which is what we use to preserve the animals, and so they tend to leach colour quite a lot. But yeah, they do. They're the same colours when they're living. But of course, colour looks different in very low light conditions, you know. So if something's red, and a lot of animals are red and orange, but in the deep sea where they are, that looks black, right? Because of the wavelengths get filtered out in the water, and so you end up only being able to see in certain wavelengths. And so, yeah, so the colours are actually used for camouflage. They look quite bright to us, but in fact they're really well camouflaged for their environment. Yeah.
Thank you. We might stop it there, but if you'd like to have a few questions with Tim afterwards, he might be able to stay for a little while. Yeah. I would like to thank Tim for reminding us that the ocean is magnificent and intriguing, and I think it's a perfect way for us to celebrate National Science Week. Thank you also to our team who put lectures together, to Moya McFadgen, Kaz McLennan, Sam Billinghurst-Walsh, Alan Flindell, Tom Spender, Matt Curran. Thank you everybody for you doing your bit. It's a team effort, and great to see you tonight, and lovely to see you again. And go the Matildas.
Yeah.